Hello everyone and welcome to lesson 3 of our nature poetry. Hope you're all well. Let's get straight into it. Okay, so this lesson is going to be comparing poems, and I did say to you that we started off the week with Death of a Naturalist, then moving on to Hawk Roosting, and now we're going to have a go today at comparing those poems. I thought I'd just get you having a little think about this first though. So just very quickly, our objective is we are learning to compare the poet's use of language and structure into poems, and also don't forget about context there as well. So I thought I'd just get your brains thinking today, and I want you to think about these quotes. Now these quotes come from all the poems in the nature collection, so the ones that I mentioned to you in lesson 1 and lesson 2, not the ones that we're studying specifically, but all the ones that fall into that category. So I thought I'd just put you to the test a little bit. So you can put me on pause here if you want to, but I will go through each quote and then I'm going to reveal the answer for each one, but I will give you some warning if you do want to pause it and have a little think yourselves. Alright, so number 1 then, which poem is this from? Where are the songs of spring? Number 2, if I should die, think only this of me. Number 3, nothing beside remains, round the decay. Number 4, then one hot day when fields were rank. Number 5, inaction, no falsifying dream. Number 6, and not a voice was idle with the din. Number 7, in hearts at peace under an English heaven. Number 8, the sun is behind me. Number 9, I sickened, turned and ran. Number 10, the lone and level sands stretch far away. Okay. Before I reveal the answers, this is a really good revision tool, because if you've gone through and you've annotated all the nature poems, or you've annotated the anthology, I don't know whereabouts you're up to, if you don't recognise these quotes, you need to try and find them in the anthology. It's a really good revision to do that. So what I'm going to do now, after 3, I will reveal the answers, so pause me here if you want to, but I am now going to put them on the screen. Okay, so 3, 2, 1, and number 1 is To Autumn. Number 2, The Soldier. Number 3, Ozymandias. Number 4, Death of a Naturalist. Number 5, In Action, No Falsifying Dream, Hawk Roosting. Number 6, Excerpt from the Prelude. Number 7, The Soldier. Number 8, Hawk Roosting. Number 9, Death of a Naturalist. And number 10, which I'm sure most of you recognise this one, it's Ozymandias. Okay, again, use that time. You don't have to rush ahead. You don't have to start to compare the poems. If you've looked at that and you thought, oh, I just didn't know half of those, I don't recognise half of those quotes, don't forget this course is new to me as well. I'm used to doing AQA. So go back and look for them. Go and find out who the poets are as well. And try and connect the title of the poem to the poet itself. Okay, really good revision. Let's move on. Back to this information I gave you in lessons 1 and 2. There are our nature poems, and there are the 2 questions from the exam. Now, I don't want you to do the first question. You don't need to. I know some of you have done it already because you've already started sending me your work, which is fantastic, and there's some really good pieces of work coming in. But in particular, what I'd like to do today, we're going to kind of pretend that we have done the single poem analysis. Now again, this is completely up to you. You can go away, you can do the single one, you can talk about Death of a Naturalist, and then you can do the comparison, and I will mark both of those if you want to. Completely up to you. But the one that we are going to do is this one today. So the example of the question that's worth 25 marks in the exam is choose one other poem from the anthology, because you are going to be doing Death of a Naturalist, in which the poet also writes about the effects of nature. Compare the way the poet presents the effects of nature in your chosen poem with the way that Seamus Heaney presents the effects of nature in Death of a Naturalist. Okay, and that's worth 25 marks. And that is your question today. So keep going back to this slide if you want to really, really focus. And you should really be focusing on the question. And if you look at what they're looking for here is the effects of nature. So it leaves it quite open for you there, really. It's different aspects of nature. Okay, so I've gone through this with you in lesson 1 and just briefly in lesson 2, the top 3 bands in terms of what you have to do for the single poems, about being perceptive, about using accurate subject terminology. But what they're also looking for here is when you go to compare the poems, they look at slightly different criteria. So let's have a quick look at that now. So band 3, ignore the marks at the top because the marks are different here because they are out of 25. So let's just have a look. So band 3, what do they expect you to be able to do? Well, you've got to be able to be focused. And that really is looking at the question. Be focused on the question across AO2. So because we're just looking really at language and structure today, that's the reason why I've written AO2. So what you've got to look at here is some valid discussion of the similarities and differences between the poems. Can you recognise what's similar? Can you recognise what's different? And can you provide that evidence to do that? To get into band 4, you need to do what you do in band 3, but you do need to be more coherent. So is it clear what you're trying to say? Are you sustained? Are you doing it all the way through? Yes, you can have the odd blip now and again, that is fine. And is there a clear discussion of the similarities and the differences between the poems? Are you taking your explanations that little bit further? Are you keeping it going throughout the essay, or are you tailing off at the end? If you start to tail off at the end a little bit, which happens sometimes, you've got the benefit of being at home. Stop, just stop and have a little think about it. You can go back to it later on because sometimes we run out of steam a little bit. Now, when it comes to the real exam, that's not going to happen because you'll have done this quite a few times. But you've only just started out doing this. And I know you've probably done a couple of essays so far with comparison, but just take your time with it. I will give you plenty of time to do this. Right at the top band here is when you're really talking about this idea of being critical. Are you really thinking about the poems? Are you really thinking about how similar they are, how different they are? And it's that idea of illuminating. It's almost having that light bulb effect and thinking, you really, really understand it. You have a clear insight as to what is going on in the poems. And again, that's sustaining it across AO2, across your language and structure. And it's the idea that you've got a wide range in discussion, not just talking about the top half of the poem or not just talking about one line in the poem. Are you looking at different aspects of those poems and giving that wide range of understanding? Okay, so we'll move on to the next bit. Alright, so as always when we do lots of things in English, we always talk about the 5-part structure, and you will be looking at doing speeches, and we'll talk to you about that, about doing the 5 parts. But in terms of putting a critical and analysis together in terms of an essay, then look at the 5-part structure for that one. So I'll put the hand up there just to kind of as a visual representation of that. Okay, so off we go. So your introduction goes without saying, and we'll look at these things in more detail as the lesson goes on. You will then come up with one idea that you can say about something that kind of transpires across both poems. You then have another idea again, and your conclusion. So you can see there that you've got your introduction and you've got your conclusion, and in the middle bit you've got your 3 developed ideas about the 2 poems. Okay. Right, just to remind you again what the question is, again you can pause me here, you can have a look, you can write the question down, but I just wanted you to have a look at that again just so we can see where we're going with this. It's the effects of nature, and we can take it anywhere that we want really. So you need to be thinking about what is it about Death of a Naturalist and Hawk Roosting that you can kind of try and find some common thread throughout those 2 poems. You may decide, by the way, to compare a different poem to Death of a Naturalist, but that is completely up to you. I really don't mind how you do this. I'm just going down the route of the 2 poems that we've studied this week. Right, let's look at planning the question then. So I'm going to take the structure of the 5 parts, but I'm going to show you how I've broken them down again. So I've got here in the middle, I've got poem 1, Death Naturalist, I've got poem 2, Hawk Roosting. And again, if you want a different poem, you just write that in there. Right, so the way that we do it, our introduction, don't forget about that, we said that before. In terms of the hand, okay, we had the first idea. Now the first idea, I've had a little think about this and I thought, okay, well what, the two poems, what is the thread that runs throughout the two poems? And I thought this idea of nature as being powerful, and you could argue that for most of the poems in the nature collection. So you won't really go you won't really go wrong, I should say, with talking about nature as being powerful. And in this aspect of the essay, I really want to start bringing language in straight away, because language analysis is so powerful to show your real insight into the poem. So that was my first idea. The second idea, I just went for form and structure, because there's so much to say about form and structure that the ideas come through automatically, and you've already got that analysis going on by using that as the basis of your paragraph. The next thing I really want to talk about, and that really is when I've spoken to you about context and saying that context is really, really important. So I didn't really want to leave out theme and context here. Always now, from this point onwards, try and use these ideas if you can. So talk about language, okay, also talk about form and structure, and also talk about theme and context. And then you've also got your conclusion, so don't forget about your conclusion. Right, so that was your 5-part structure that we looked at before with the hand. So in terms of breaking that down, this is what you do. Okay, let's look at introduction first of all. So what I really want to say here is I want to talk about how both poems explore the effects of nature, but are from different viewpoints. So I'll take that a little bit further in a minute, but don't forget this is only the planning stage. So you're only really starting to get your ideas together about what is it you want to say in your essay. Alright, so just taking it a little bit further then. So what do I want to say in my introduction? Okay, so poem 1, this idea of the death of naturalist, the narrator, who is the boy from the child's point of view, is controlled by nature. Starts off being fascinated with it, is a naturalist, and eventually becomes repulsed by nature and changes as a result of that. In poem 2, the hawk actually represents the power of the natural world. So the hawk is nature itself. So don't always think of nature as being the mountains, the sea, the forests, etc. You know, it is the animal world as well, and we call it the natural world. So that's my introduction. And keep going back to this if you want to, you're not too sure what to say. So my first idea then was really to start incorporating language, and I really wanted to talk about how nature was powerful, and that is where the language comes through, because a lot of the language in both poems does actually talk about the power of nature. Alright, so poem 1, I really wanted to go down the route of the descriptive harsh language, you know, those verbs that were used in Death of Naturalist, and the idea of the use of personification makes it seem alive right at the beginning. And poem 2 was almost factual and very authoritative, wasn't it? You know, in the way the hawk was actually speaking. So I've gone down the route of using monosyllabic language. You can already see a contrast in the language that's used in both of the poems to show nature as power. Form and structure then, again, you just need to go back to your poems and have a look at what you've actually written here, and I've just briefly summarised it. So poem 1 is blank verse, and we discussed the fact that it's iambic pentameter and this idea of respect, but again I'm going to talk to you about that a little bit later on. But I think here I can't write too much on my planning stage, but I do need to know what I'm talking about here. So if you're not too sure what I mean here when I'm saying iambic pentameter, it's written in blank verse, there's a lack of a rhyme scheme, please go back to your notes that you've made in the previous 2 lessons to remind yourself. Also, you might want to return to the PowerPoints as well, just to have a look and clarify that. But remember, your iambic pentameter is used in sonnets. It represents love, it represents respect for someone. Here he respects nature, but that lack of a rhyme scheme, it's kind of, he's not quite sure how he feels about it. But again, you go back and you have a look at that yourselves in your own poems. And then poem 2 It is the dramatic monologue to a silent reader. So this hawk does not care that he doesn't want anybody else to answer him back. This is what he thinks. It's in free verse because this idea that he is free, or it is free to do what it wants, and it is very, very controlling. So again, I'm just really sum that up there, but you go back to your notes and you check that before you begin to write this. Your theme and context. So poem 1 deals with the childhood experiences of nature, the way that he felt as a boy, and how we change throughout life. You know, that optimism, that obsession, that passion that we have for something, and that's what we talked about in lesson 1. And at this point I want to bring in context, and I want to bring in Seamus Heaney here about how this influenced his poem, about the type of background that he had. And again, go back to your notes if you're not sure about that one. And then poem 2, the idea that nature is more powerful than humans. And actually Ted Hughes, and I know we've talked about this allegory in the poem, that this could be something to do with a human being, someone who's like almost like a war machine, but he did say, actually no, it's not, it's nature expressing itself. That's up to you, by the way, and again, you might have decided already that perhaps it could show this, it's allegorical, okay, but I was just going down the nature route with this one. So I want to really bring in the poets here and their context. Now, the way that I've done this, by the way, it does not have to be done in a certain order. You might start off with theme and context and then move on to language. It's completely up to you. I felt here that looking at language, then looking at form and structure, actually gave me my ideas for theme and context. But again, that's completely up to you how you do it. And then your conclusion, really, is asking yourself, because lots of students always say, how do I do a conclusion? What do I put in my conclusion? Well, your conclusion really is summing up everything that you have said in your essay, in your piece of writing. And you should always ask yourself at the end, what do we learn from this? What are we supposed to get out of this? Now, I've put here the idea that both poems present the idea of nature as powerful and threatening. Slightly different ways, but they both do that. And nature is more powerful than humanity, because if you think about it, you've got the idea of the power through the hawk, and you know, the idea the hawk felt it was even superior to nature, and the idea that the boy feels threatened by the frogs right at the end of the poem, and he's threatened by nature. So what we should learn, really, is always the same thread that runs through nature poems, is that humanity should respect this. They should respect nature. So you can't always go wrong with that one, really. Okay, right, everyone, so that's my plan. You can keep going back to this if you want to sort of help you, guide you in your writing today. Okay, so the stage 3 then is actually writing your response. So I just want to read this through with you, and then I'll explain to you why I've colour coded certain things as we go through. Now, what I've done here is I've only given you a response, so a waggle, what a good one looks like, for the introduction and the beginning of the first idea about language. So if you remember the hand, it's just the introduction and the first part of the first idea, if that makes sense. And it was to do with language. Right, let's go. Both Death of a Naturalist and Hawk Roosting explore the effects of nature, but from different viewpoints. Heaney's poem is written from the viewpoint of a child who begins by calling himself a naturalist and is clearly fascinated with the flax stem and animal element of nature in his own rural environment. His experience of this natural world throughout his childhood changes him, and he becomes threatened and repulsed by it. In Hawk Roosting, Hughes narrates the poem through the eyes of the hawk. Its arrogance and sense of superiority reflects the controlling and powerful characteristics of the natural world. What I did here was I kept going back to my plan and saying, what was it that I wanted to say? I wanted to make sure that I was focused on the question in terms of the effects of nature. Let's just look at the next paragraph and I'll explain further what the blue highlighting is. In Heaney's poem, he represents the boy's viewpoint of nature through the use of descriptive yet harsh verbs such as rotted, punishing and gargled to suggest that this environment is not as fragile and beautiful as we perceive it to be. Notice what we use the word, when we use the word language here, we're picking out words and phrases that are quite strong in the poem. The use of personification highlights the idea that it's almost alive and so controls the boy's opinions, which is what personification does. It controls the character in the text. Though he is fascinated at this point, as Heaney employs oxymoron and gargle delicately to emphasise the boy's wonder and perhaps confusion. In contrast, Hughes includes monosyllabic language too, and I've left it there because I could go on forever with that one. I could give you a whole essay, okay, but I didn't want to do that because I want you to go away and have a little think about this yourselves. So then, the actual blue highlighting here is to show, look at how it's repeating all the way through. So I've mentioned the poems, and sometimes it's quite frustrating for a student because sometimes when the poem is quite long, like Death of a Naturalist, and I know Dulce Decorum Est is quite a handful as well, isn't it? Quite a mouthful to actually, and a handful, I should say, to write down. It's a mouthful to say. Then you can just refer to the poet. That is fine, but make sure it's clear which is which and you know which is which as you're going through the poem. So you can see here as I've gone through, I've repeated all the way through because the question does ask you about how the poem does something, how the poets get something across. So you need to keep repeating that as you go through. So look there, you've got Death of a Naturalist, you've got Hawk Roosting, you've got Heaney, Hughes, Heaney's poem, Heaney, Hughes. You can see it as it goes through. So keep referring back to the writer, to the poet. Alright, so here what I've done is I have highlighted where I've used evidence. Notice in the actual introduction you don't need to use evidence in the introduction necessarily, but if you get the opportunity to do it, then do it. And if you're repeating something that's in the poem, just put it in inverted commas because you're taking it out of the poem. It's actually quite impressive if you do that at the beginning. And then there you go, you've got your ideas of your verbs here also highlighted. And always try and avoid long quotations because they don't really tell us much. It's always much better to focus in on very sort of short phrases or actual individual words here. And we call this, it's almost like a semantic field. They've got something in common with each other. Okay, they're harsh verbs that describe nature. And it's also personification, which is what I've mentioned in the essay. You can see here I've done gargle delicately and I've explained as well. Now don't forget, you always need to explain why they're actually used. So you've got the idea to suggest this, to emphasise this. That is the way that you get into band 4. Okay, to keep going through and actually pulling it out and saying, well, what does it suggest? What does it emphasise? And always explaining your subject terminology. And there you go, everyone. I've actually highlighted the terminology here. And as you can see, I don't just leave it. I don't just say this is this is personification. I actually say the use of personification highlights the idea. He uses oxymoron to suggest that actually he's quite confused by it. He's quite fascinated, but he's quite confused by nature here. So I'm giving you an explanation as we go through. It's no point you saying it if you've got nothing to say about it. Try and have a little think about what I might have said here about monosyllabic language, and all of that is in your notes on your poem. Okay. All right, everyone. So I thought it was quite, it'd be quite useful for you to actually put in useful words and phrases. Some of you won't need it, but I think sometimes we have this habit of repeating ourselves when we write something. So let's have a quick look what I mean here. So when you're talking about both poems, and what we do is we don't just deal with one poem, half the essay, and then deal with the other one. We actually weave it throughout. So we go and actually talk about the introduction, we introduce one poem, then the second poem. We then talk about language, we introduce poem 1, we then do poem 2. So you're interweaving it all the way through. So phrases that you're actually going to use are things like both poems do this. You then might separate the poems, go similarly, Hawk Roosting does this, whereas, you can use that word whereas, not written on the board, but you can use that word. You've got phrases like in contrast, you've got the word however. Also as well, which I'm sure many of you hate the fact that you might do this, the idea this shows, or even this suggests, that's quite a popular one. But instead of saying this shows, you can say things like this suggests, not too much though, highlights, this emphasises, this reinforces, if you're trying to take the point even further. The poet employs something, the poet uses something, the poet includes this, the poet incorporates this. So instead of just saying the poet uses something over and over again, trying to use those different words to make your essay, I suppose, more interesting, and it's much nicer to read as well when it's not as repetitive. And again, I did say before, and just a reminder really here, you do not have to do hawk roosting as a comparison with Death of a Naturalist. You may want to do another nature poem, and the reason why I don't really want you to change Death of a Naturalist, because that would be, in this example of this lesson, that is actually the named poem in the exam question that I've given you. So you can't change that. You can't change the named poem. But you can do any poem that you want to, that you think fits with the question, that you can compare with that poem that's been named. Okay. So I've put here, now you can skip over this if you really don't feel that you need any help in it. But what I've done is I've just kind of put a structure together, and I've done the 5 parts, as you can see. I've not written the essay for you, I've just kind of shown you what you really need to be doing here. So this is only if you are really struggling. Keep referring back to that waggle as well that I've done. So as you can see at the top, I've written here, both Death of a Naturalist and Hawk Roosting explore the effects of nature, but from different viewpoints, and see my waggle on slide 9. Okay, it's already been written, that one. You can change it, you can adapt it, you can do anything you want with that one. Then the language part of it is the first idea. This is where we go with the first idea. In Heaney's poem, he represents the boy's viewpoint of nature through the use of. In contrast, Hughes includes monosyllabic language too. Now try and go with, if you can, with 2 examples. So you might pick out with Heaney, you might start with the harsh verbs at the beginning, yet to show that he's quite fascinated with nature. But don't forget that bit at the end, the last stanza, when he uses that military language. You know, the idea of invaded, cocked, the idea of grenades. It's quite violent, and it is the fact that he feels threatened by it. So that's what I mean by 2 examples, and it shows change in the poem as well. Now with Hughes, you know, he does use monosyllabic language, which sounds very arrogant, it sounds very confident, it sounds quite threatening. But also don't forget, he does also use metaphor as well when he talks about things to do with the allotment of death, you know, through the bones of the living. So that idea of using that imagery, so he does use imagery as well as monosyllabic language to show the power of nature. So always have those 2 examples of language in that particular bit. Then your structure, again, this is going back to your notes, and try and use those 2 examples. So you, again, I think I've already written it in the plan. You might talk about, with Death of a Naturalist, you might talk about the idea of first person narration. You might talk about the blank verse. You might talk about the fact that, you know, there's lack of a rhyme scheme. So that's up to you. You can give loads of examples actually about structure. So it's quite a nice, I think it's a nice part of the essay, this one. It's quite a straightforward one. And then with Hughes, again, you can mention the different things you can say about dramatic monologue. You can talk about short, abrupt sentences. You can talk about it being free verse. So that's up to you. Okay, but again, I think that's probably to me, that is the easiest part of it. But again, you might like language better. You might think that's easier. And then you are then going to talk about the themes and context. So Heaney's experience of life is shown in this poem because, and make sure you're giving us detail there and you're using evidence. And then likewise, or even in contrast, it's up to you, Hughes informs us that and really give details there about that. But again, go back to the plan and see what I've done there. And then finally, or in conclusion, both poems. And again, those 3 points that I made in the plan would actually make up your conclusion. They would actually give you a conclusion. And really, if you have struggled with how to put this together, then the way that I've put this lesson together, you should really get a grip in terms of how to put it together. I don't mind you using this structure, as long as that next time when you do it again, you come away from this a little bit. Now you can have a go at using a different poem if you like, using this structure, if you really feel that you want to show that you do know about the poems and you do understand what the poem is about. But I don't mind either way. Okay, just challenge yourself maybe. Okay, have a little go. All right, so that leaves me there to kind of say good luck with it. Go back over the PowerPoint, check it, you know, are there things that you want from it? Use your poems, always have your poems in front of you when you're at this stage. When you do get to the real exam, you will only have the named poem in front of you. So you will only have Death the Naturalist in this instance without any of your annotations. But because you are only just starting out with this, then I would use the anthology to help you. When you get further on your GCSE, then that is when you try to practice without the poems in front of you. Okay, so I'll see you all soonish. Okay, and like I said before, good luck, and I will be in touch soon. Bye everyone.